morning and welcome to the 2017 edition of the UIC Urban Forum. My name is Mike Pagano. I'm the Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois Chicago and the Director of the UIC Urban Forum. And it's a pleasure to be here again, a different venue, but still on a topic that I think we will all find of interest. So on behalf of the co-chairs, as you know, Tony Preckwinkle, the president of the Cook County Board, and Michael Amaritis, the chancellor of the University of Illinois Chicago, are the co-chairs of this event. And I welcome you to the 6th annual UIC Urban Forum and the 23rd annual UIC hosted conference on urban challenges of contemporary society. The theme of this year's conference is, as you can see, the public infrastructure of work and play. And let me just take a few minutes to say what that is all about and why it came about. When the team met to decide on what the theme of this year's conference should be, we thought that with the new administration coming in and hoisting the banner of infrastructure and infrastructure investment, we thought that we had found something that would cross the divide and would get the country behind it, and we would have something to talk about at this forum. That didn't happen, but we do have, there may be something coming. But regardless, what we did find in this conversation is that there are a couple of ways of thinking about infrastructure, in particular urban infrastructure. Infrastructure, I think, if you go back 30 or 40 years, the average American would never have any idea what you were talking about if you used the words infrastructure. If you said interstate highway and bridges, they might. But if you said infrastructure, they're not sure what you're talking about. That word has come into the lexicon of American society only in the past probably 30 years in a way that we think of it as roads and bridges and water treatment facilities and sidewalks and those sorts of hard things that cities and states invest in for the purpose of promoting economic growth and development. And so we think of the return on investment of infrastructure in a way, the way it has enhanced the economic profile of a community or of a state. But there are other kinds of capital or fixed asset investments that cities and states make, and those are in the kinds of infrastructure of, we might call it green space, we might call it, as we've seen lately, the importance of public monuments, the purpose of which are to last for decades and decades and decades. But the promotion of economic growth and development is really a secondary concern. The primary concern is really to shape the feel of the city, to improve or enhance its quality of life, and to make this the kind of society that we want to have. So when we started thinking about infrastructure, we thought of it in two ways, and we probably used the wrong words, and I'll take the blame for that, a soft infrastructure and a hard infrastructure. The hard infrastructure promoting economic growth and development, and the soft infrastructure promoting the quality of life. So we have two great panels for you this morning with two terrific keynote speakers that will be the bookends, both the beginning and the end of the conference coming up, and they're all in your program. Also, and the seats, and also on the seats is a book, which is the tchotchke that we hand out at the beginning of the conference, and it is it's a compendium of the white papers that were the background pieces to last year's UIC Urban Forum on the topic of which was jobs. The white papers for this urban forum are also posted on our website. They are written by academics, and they provide, I think, a great overview of infrastructure and infrastructure investment in both for the soft and the hard kinds of infrastructure that we're talking about. Those white papers will also be produced over the course of the next year and ready for next year's 2018 UIC Urban Forum to be delivered as the free gift of admission when you get here. So the purpose of this forum is actually to bring some intellectual underpinning to very contemporary policy issues. The academic colleagues are the ones who provide the underpinning, the intellectual underpinning to this, as you can see from the book, and the panelists are going to explain what in the world is happening in the real world today. Before I continue, I want to recognize our partners, our continuous partners since the beginning of the UIC Urban Forum, and that's the MacArthur Foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, Public Media WBEZ, the wonderful College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, and the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. So Thank you all for coming here and for joining us. We will, the procedure for the day is that we will begin with a keynote presentation by Carol Ross Barney, move to the two panels, and then end with the keynote presentation by Randy Blankenhorn, the Secretary of the Illinois Department of Transportation. There will be, at the end, please stay. At the end, there are box lunches that are in the way back there that you can take with you and go home, or you can set up in one of the rooms either right directly behind us here, or in over here in the Cardinal Room on the west side of the building. So please stay and enjoy a lunch. So our first keynote speaker this morning is Carol Ross Barney, FAIA, and she's been in the vanguard of civic space design since founding Ross Barney Architects in 1981. She's made significant contributions to the built environment, the profession, and architectural education, and she has advocated for excellent design as a right and not as a privilege. Her projects uphold a deep commitment to the role of architecture plays in the quality of life, hence her invitation to be our keynote speaker today and for the first panel. She's been honored with over 100 design awards, including 4 National AIA Institute Honor Awards, 40 AIA Chicago Awards, and 2 AIA Committee on the Environment Top 10 Projects. For nearly 2 decades, her studio has been working along the Chicago's river, and if you haven't been along the Chicago Riverwalk, I encourage you to do that and try to understand what that deer's doing in the end of the walk. So the other notable projects include the Bloomingdale, the 606 Trail Master Plan, the CTA Cermak McCormick Place, and Morgan Street stations, the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation, among many others. Carol Ross Barney is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, after which she served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica, and she teaches Advanced Design Studio at IIT and serves on their College Board of Overseers. We welcome Carol to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning. The deer is a sculpture by Tony Tassett. So if you go, it does look scared. And, but the one you can't miss is the one that's at Wacker and Wabash, the real fake sculpture. And if you hold your phone exactly right, you can take a selfie that's at you, real fake, and Trump in the background. It's a fantastic, fantastic opportunity for a social comment. Okay. I am an architect, an educator, and a native Chicagoan. And so I look at this and I look at this and I my heart gets really excited. I'm so fond of this city. But when you look at this, it talks about 2 things. It talks about the infrastructure we need, and it talks about what we have to do for our infrastructure. You can look at this and say, this is a gleaming city, or you can say, oh my God, why are they still using those high-pressure sodium lights? In fact, this picture, if you remember, it was on the cover of National Geographic, and it made Chicago the poster child for light pollution. In any case, what I'm going to talk about today is the power that design can have on infrastructure. And I'm not going to talk about some of the really beautiful romantic projects that the city's done. I'm going to talk about smaller projects, grittier projects, ones that talk about access, that talk about equity, and about inserting design on both small and large stages. And I'm going to start out by talking about 2 CTA stations that we did design these, but I'm really proud of them because they changed the areas they're in. One station is at Morgan, and the other one is at Cermak on the Green Line. And it's really interesting because both of these locations had stations in the past, but in the brave new world of the 1950s, our interstate era, ridership was down on the CTA, and the city, the planners, in wisdom, decided that we didn't need these stations anymore. And quite honestly, that probably was true. There was this fallow ring around the city where old uses had moved out to the bright suburbs. And as it turned out, with our population changing, there was an opportunity to program stations in these spots. And when the CTA looked at this initially, they projected not really high riderships for them. They saw a need enough to support a station. But what's happened since these have been constructed is really amazing. I'm going to talk about Morgan first. Morgan and the Fulton Market District, it's been transformed over the past few years. The Fulton Market is now headquarters to Google. McDonald's is moving in at the end of the summer. They've added a substantial number of residential units, and this station is already serving 150% of its projected ridership. Doing an infill station architecturally is a bit of a challenge because often there's not the space or the opportunity that you have at a green grass site. But the objective in every case is to create an environment that's pleasurable to be in, so you can improve the quality of urban space. For this one in particular, I'm going to go back one slide. One of the biggest challenges was there was no site for it. Basically, we had the elevated structure and no place to collect fares. And so the solution, which you see here, is we appropriated 3 parking spaces on either side of the street and designed fare collection to happen there. Coincidentally, actually by design, by extending that footprint up, we could create an icon that would direct people to the CTA, but that also would represent this neighborhood. The next station I want to talk about is Cermak. This one is, I think this one is still a story that has to be written, but since this station has come online, there have been announcements of over 2,300 hotel rooms, 3,500 apartments. The 10,000-seat DePaul Arena, which is about to open this month, are all served by this station. Like Morgan Station, we had a really restricted site, and so I think that this is where a designer is challenged. In this particular site, we had to do a center platform, and it could only be 14 feet because that's the right-of-way that the CTA owns right now. That's the area between the tracks. So what we did is we designed a canopy that you see there that spans from side to side rather than putting columns on the platform, rather than putting windbreaks on the platform. We enclose the whole station. Because the budget, it's funny, Blair Kamen writes that these are so expensive. Morgan was they're both about $50 million, but that's, I'm sure that planners know that that's a drop in the bucket for urban systems like this. And one of the cost-saving methods for this station is the new platforms are supported on new structure, and where the existing bents that carry the rail fell in the station, we left them there, and they are in their wonderful 100-year form still. So you can see the intersection of these two systems. But by doing that, by not having to rebuild the rail, we saved probably another $50 million. So design is so important for these, not just for the character of the station, but also for the feasibility of the project. The next project I'm going to talk about is a little bit different because it's the same in that an existing asset was made more useful, but this one is probably more dramatic and has had more effect on the entire city. And this is the Chicago Riverwalk project, which basically reclaims an infrastructure that had been abandoned and neglected. I told you, as a native Chicagoan, I couldn't believe, if someone told me, 20 years ago you were going to picnic by the river, I'd think you were crazy. And I think most Chicagoans would agree with me. It was our backyard. It wasn't something we thought about. In fact, this is a picture of the Riverwalk when we started on that project. And you can look at it and you say, what Riverwalk? And you would be totally correct. The Riverwalk has been a subject of study for a long time. In fact, Burnham drew this in his 1909 plan, a beautiful watercolors by Jules Deguerin, and you can see that he had a very beautiful promenade. This, by the way, was at the confluence. He envisioned a big turning basin there, very round, beautiful civic improvement. But the real gem of the idea there was he was proposing a two-level roadway system with a lower level that would serve to service the buildings of the loop, and then this upper civic level. And you can see that even in this 1926 drawing that was done by the city, they envisioned that they would have a promenade that would stretch along the river. But the truth of the matter is, this is the construction. By the way, a lot of Wacker Drive was raised and built on pilings. But the truth of the matter is that when they built new bridge houses in later projects, the bridge houses necessarily sat right in the water. You can see them there. And so the effect was that the planned Riverwalk, you could walk a block, and then you'd have to take stairs up 22 feet, come back, cross 4 lanes of active traffic, and come back down 22 feet. There weren't a lot of people who were strolling on our kind of orphan Riverwalk. So the city, there have been always a lot of planners, though, that thought about this problem. And finally, in 2002, an opportunity presented itself to the city to do something about it. And interestingly enough, the opportunity was not about the Riverwalk. The opportunity was that this structure, the Wacker Drive structure, now 76 years old, needed to be renewed. And the city organized a TIF district to pay for the renewal. And as a small part of that project, the planning of the Riverwalk began. And originally, we were working on this a little blue piece at the far eastern end. And the far eastern end was Michigan Avenue, and then you can see Wabash and State. So the first is from Michigan to State. And this section, which was completed in 2005, was very interesting because the Wacker project actually made a big difference, made this hugely feasible. This whole plaza, those of you who are Chicagoans, this is Wabash Plaza with the Vietnam Memorial. The Vietnam Memorial used to be at street level in the middle of traffic. There was a little triangle there, and traffic would whiz around it. And by changing the roadway as part of that Wacker Drive reconstruction, that was created. But the big problem that we had to solve was how do you walk around those bridge houses? That was a bigger problem. Because riverways and lakeways are controlled by Congress, you can't change the course of a river or the riverbank without congressional action. The city really couldn't do anything. We couldn't build new land. We couldn't build around it. So the city was forced to go to Congress, and through the Volpe Transportation Center, Congress granted, the Department of Transportation granted the city the right to build new land 25 feet wide under the bridges, and 25 feet, 20 feet under the bridges and 25 feet in between the bridges. So this was the answer. Now we could get under the bridges. And that was sort of the eureka. The thing that was interesting is when that first project was finished, the 2005 Phase 1 project, people started to go and sit down by the river. Loop workers would have lunch there. And the city took notice. Blair wrote about that again. He said, oh, wow, this is Chicago's second coastline. We didn't know we had it. And the city decided to push a little bit farther. And they commissioned us to do phases 2, and it turned out to be 3, which had to do with the funding. And that was great because for the first time we could think about this in more than sort of very conceptual terms. In the end, we were really concerned with making a continual path, and we were also concerned about the identity for each room, and you can see we used river typologies for them. Almost all the construction was done on water side, marine side, which was something that, being a prairie architect, I can't say I do this very often. Yes, 2 barges did sink. We had nothing to do with it. That was a contractor. And the completed project, the first section opened in 2015, and it included 3 blocks. This one, which is called the Cove, you can moor your yacht here if you happen to have one. This one, which is called the Jetty, which is designed to accommodate human-powered craft, so it is a really small freeboard, 6 inches to a foot. And this opened also, the River Theater. Our idea here at the River Theater was that we wanted to basically turn the river up to the city and the city down to the river. So by making this monumental staircase, it gave us an opportunity to allow people to actually see the river from Wacker Drive. It also functions as an accessible entrance midway on the Riverwalk. And then in 2016, 3 more blocks opened. And these, the first 3 blocks, I have to admit, are a little bit yuppified, although I'm still extraordinarily proud of them. When we were working on the design, we sort of imagined, we said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a wine bar in this block? And, and we went out for proposals, and sure enough, City Winery put in this. And so people sit there, thousands of people. You have to wait in line now to sit there. And they buy River Red, River Rosé, and River White for about $15 a glass. And that's not exactly family pleasure, although it's very pleasurable. And I think the next blocks that opened really this year, but their sort of soft opening was last fall, are much more family-oriented and more fun-oriented. And that includes this block, which is called the Water Hole, which has a interactive water feature. Although you still, on most days, cannot swim in the Chicago River, at the Water Plaza, you can pretend that you're swimming in the Chicago River. And the Jetty, which has floating gardens, and is an expansion of the fish hotel that the Friends of the River created years ago. Underneath these floating gardens, we have habitat for fish, and of course they eat the crustaceans that grow in the root system, the biofilms. So when you're walking by there, that's what's actually happening below. We've made additional fish hotels so fish can do what fish do in hotels, and so they can also eat. One of the nice programs, so this is a collection that the members of my studio have made from Instagram, people who are posting what they're doing on the Riverwalk. And if you look through it, those are really small, but people do almost anything on the Riverwalk, and it's really thrilling to go by it and find out that it's a tremendous asset, both for the people who live here and for people who are visiting the city. One of the things I'm really proud of is you can walk at Lake Street now all the way to the museum campus without having to cross traffic, which is really amazing when you think about the type of environment that makes in the city. But one of the biggest legacies, I put this in to brag about what happened there, but I probably don't have to brag because I know you are Chicagoans, but these are buildings that have been built since the inception of the Riverwalk. It's over $2 billion in value, over 1,000 rental units, and over 2.3 million square feet of office space. And what really is, have you noticed every new office building, a lot of new housing developments are called River something or other? The other person I have to compliment, because he needs compliments, but because also this is really a masterstroke, is Mayor Emanuel, because this project was built without tax dollars, without city tax dollars. In the end, it was built with a loan from the Department of Transportation that the city's paying back by use fees on the Riverwalk, which has a really wonderful symmetry and satisfying effect. But the best part, I think, is what the Riverwalk has done to the rest of the city. With the rest of the city, what they know about the infrastructure that they have. This is Bubbly Creek. I think it's probably early 20th century. And that man, this is a very famous photograph. That man is standing on an island of congealed fat from the slaughterhouses. And in a lot of ways, that was the history of our river. And people cared not to remember it. But with the success of the Riverwalk, the mayor asked the Metropolitan Planning Council to look at the river and envision the river, what the river could be in 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years. And the beauty of this is that the river goes everywhere in the city. It's not at all, it's not prejudice at all about economics or race or anything else. It goes to all neighborhoods. We have 150 miles of riverbank in the city of Chicago, and 3 major rivers. And so MPC's job was to study what this could mean to our city and to envision those changes. And MPC asked us to support them in that study. And we held community meetings. When Josh Ellis talks about this, he talks about the thousands of people. I can never remember those numbers. I just remember we talked to a lot of people. We surveyed people about their relationship with the river, and we helped envision what the river can mean. Like I said, the river is very democratic, so it means that here at Goose Island, after talking to this community, we envisioned a floating wetlands park. I mean, there had been talk of filling in the east channel of Goose Island, but this, after talking, we thought, why don't we play up the physical and natural aspects of the river? This is the Collateral Channel in Pilsen, the other end of the economic spectrum to some extent, and an area that is fallen into disuse, and to a certain extent, it's still damaged by the use we put it to. The Collateral Channel is a series of canals that were built to service manufacturers who had factories and plants along the river, and now that those are gone, these canals are largely abandoned, and part of the problem is they're also stagnant. So the city built this wonderful new park, Little Village Park. You can see it up in the upper right-hand corner. And when we went to see this community, the kids were joking because the Collateral Channel smelled so bad. They said they didn't call it Little Village Park, they called it Ass Park. So this one has a long story, because this is what you can do there with some investment. But it also has a short story, because at that point the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, hearing the community, started pumping the water, so it's no longer stagnant. It's not the whole fix. It's still not usable by the community, but that's like the little impact that the study would make. The final impact is to turn this into usable land. In fact, we envision using it as a swimming pool for the community in a reasonable period of time. There, swimming in the Chicago River in Little Village. This is Riverdale. Hardly any infrastructure like the Riverwalk, but here's a really simple change to the Riverdale lakefront there. This one is a real easy one too. I mean, living in the city, you really appreciate green areas, and they're essential to the health of an urban area. This is the Desplaines River bike path. You can get to it by the CTA. The blue line goes to Cumberland. If you know where it is, where the entrance is, you could go, it's about 2 blocks, and then you have access to 50 miles of bike trail. And the CTA will even carry your bike, but the current condition, it's unmarked. So this one is as simple as providing a visible entrance and information about the asset. So they went the whole gamut. We did meet with the community, by the way, at Bubbly Creek at Ashland, and we talked to them, and so this is what they would like to do. And this would be the very spot that man was standing on the congealed grease. And that's a potential for our river. So the thing about the projects is not only do they change the quality of life, they change what people believe they can do with their environment. And I encourage you, people are still thinking about the river. The biennial opens today. And one of the things that's at the biennial is an exhibit that's going to talk about the edges of the river. The city invited 9 architects to think about the river, 3 sites. It's in the gallery right north of the Cultural Center. I forget what it's called. But anyway, you'll be able to see visions. This is our vision. We took the piece of the river right at the St. Charles Airline, if you know the area, right north of Cta Park. This part of the river was straightened to make it more better for industry. And so it's this very straight piece, and what we decided that would happen there, that would be a great ritual to start, is to have dragon boat races and swimming races in this straight part of the river. So we've called it the St. Charles Raceway. And here you can see the dragon boats racing there. But I think that the exhibit's fun. There's some hard thought there too. But it represents how you can change people's idea about an asset and how an asset could really start improving the quality of life. So thank you. If I get to answer questions if you have any. How much time do I have left? 7 minutes of questions. Okay, thank you. I was waiting if I had to stand here for 7 minutes with no questions.
It's all great stuff. I live on the river. I love it. But one thing that's striking to me about this is that most of where the money has already been spent absolutely benefits upper middle class, upper class, higher economic spread. Yes, the Morgan Street and the McCormick stations are useful, and again, I use both of them, but as opposed to how do we extend the CTA out in order to get people to jobs, and how do we deal with some of these other issues that are intrinsic and somehow avoid making the bulk of our quality of life infrastructure spending on those people who already have the best quality of life?
I think that you've really put your finger on the question about who we are and where our city goes from here. I picked these 3 projects for the reason of showing the contrast and the potential of different types of projects. But I think that's a question for the future of our city. And the transit one's particularly interesting. We've started to make a data map in our studio where you overlap income and transportation and education to start identifying corridors that can change and start to think about the types of projects that will change those things. And I know the city has initiatives like that too. One of the things that's come out of the Riverwalk, the Great Rivers Project, for example, now is the MPC is helping to administer a fund from the Chicago Community Trust that starts distributing planning money to these same communities that talked to us during the design of the vision. So you're asking the right question. I don't think that there's a simple answer to it, except that we will. Okay, I only have one questioner.
Have you ever considered taking the Riverwalk and connecting the Pilsen and Chinatown with the loop ferry, Michigan Avenue, connected all together?
That's a really good question, because that's the city's next project. They're starting it this fall. They've commissioned a transportation engineer to look at the river from Lake Street down to Cta Park in Chinatown, and to establish what the project is. Again, it'll be probably acquiring permission to change the riverbank, so it'll take some federal action. I always like talking about the Riverwalk because I say, you say you have projects that took an act of Congress. Mine really did. But that project's underway now. And actually, the last thing I showed you, the River Edges exhibit, deals with 3 of the sites on the South Branch that they're sort of an example of the conditions that are there. The first site that the designers dealt with is the Civic Opera House, which was built about 1920, and at that point the river was probably at its despicable worst. and you can see that the Opera House just drops its wall right at the river. They would care less if it was there. So that has a lot of potential off the top of your head for a river walk, but you'll see how some designers solve that if you go to the exhibit. The next site that they were tasked with was the where Congress crosses over the river, which is a little bit of a no man's land. There's some new residential there. The city's constructed some parks. They're not heavily used, but to just create an environment that's usable and friendly, maybe educational at that point. And then the last site was the one I showed you at Pingtop Park. I think destined to be a transportation node. There's talk about using the airline, not the airline, but a crossing there to connect the lakefront path with the Paseo, the new Paseo path. And there's a lot of other important things that are happening. Right south of that bridge is a site that's owned by United Midwest, Related Midwest, 62 acres, that's going to be developed in the coming years. And it gives a chance to talk about that riverfront and what owners on the river need to do for the city. The city has an ordinance that requires any new properties or any substantially remodeled properties on the river that the owner provide 30 feet of right-of-way, public right-of-way, accessible as a river walk. And it'll be interesting to see what some of these big river projects like Related and like Riverline, which is immediately north of that, what they do for the river and for the people of Chicago and for the connectivity that you're asking about. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you to everyone. We all have our selfies now in front of the on the Riverwalk in front of that building. The first panel of the day is called Building a Just City, Shaping Communities' Quality of Life, and it will be moderated by Alexandra Solomon of WBEZ, and a few folks would come to the front here. The other panelists are Miguel Aguilar, who is an artist, a mural artist, Gia Biaggi, a principal of Urbanism and Civic Impact at Studio Gang, and one of our esteemed alumni of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. Juanita Irizarry, the Executive Director of Friends of the Park, and Scott Stewart, the Executive Director of the Millennium Park Foundation. Welcome.
Yay. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to do this panel. I'm the editor of Curious City, which is a project at WBEZ that's all about engaging the community, and I'll talk a little bit about that perhaps as we go through the panel, because I think there's some things we've learned that maybe relate some of the work you all do. You know, I was thinking about the title of our conversation here, Building a Just City, Shaping Communities' Quality of Life. And I think, you know, when we think about quality of life, you have to think about sort of the way that people interact with one another, what it feels like for people to live in a city. And, you know, we're in an interesting time right now in our country. We had this sort of very divisive election. I've seen some kind of crazy statistics. Only 52% of Americans have faith in our democracy. Only 1 out of 3 Americans trust one another. Those are pretty kind of staggering statistics that sort of speak to, I think, this divide we've seen and that we see in a city like Chicago. And so I'm wondering if you all could talk about the role that you think, the way we design and create our public spaces, parks, works of art, what role do they have to play in sort of engaging people with one another? And I don't know, Gia, if you want to start. I know this is something you've thought.
Sure, as the mobster has to go first. No, thank you for the question, and thanks again to Carol for that great presentation. I think it's great to see kind of a broad vision for infrastructure, and I think as we talk about the way that built environments are really the containers for encounters between people and the role that design plays in that, it's something that we're thinking a lot about in the practice that we're doing. I should explain, I do work for Studio Gang and lead a practice called Urbanism, so I'm a planner in a sea of architects, which is like being a unicorn there, which is great, but it also is part of bringing my background as a former recovering city official. So having actually have to maintain these sets of infrastructure and now get to play with them as design. And so I think this question about how do we build trust is one that we're actually working on in a number of different dimensions, and recognizing that there are all kinds of factors that have to do with design that have something to do with the relationships that we have in those spaces. So some of the stats I think that are out there now that are pretty interesting are things pulled together by the Knight Foundation Soul of the City study that found that people who thought their community was beautiful were 28% more likely to trust police. Now that is a bizarre statistic, right? And that's correlation and probably not causation, but what does that mean for when we have public infrastructure in every neighborhood, right? And so we can touch every neighborhood with what we own in common, and where we invest in a way that is suggesting that beauty matters, that making buildings that are easy to get into. If my library seems intimidating and it's also my polling place, I might not walk over that transom to pull a lever. And so I think there's a role for design to play in that, in addition to what we can do with public facilities themselves that might be the core asset in a neighborhood. It's what we have to work with. How can we invest in a way that transforms what might be a library or a park building or a police station into something that is more relevant to the community where it resides?
Juanita?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. You know, Friends of the Parks has been talking a lot lately about parks as democratic spaces and what that means. And a lot of times folks talk about that from a design point of view, landscape architecture point of view. But we've been asking a lot of questions based on what we're hearing from the community about whether people feel like their parks are democratic spaces, especially as we see communities gentrify or investment happen in a park where folks think it is becoming more beautiful, but it's not for them. And so how do we engage people to care about their parks? You know, one of our important roles over the years has been to organize and support park advisory councils, which is a really important part of people feeling a sense of community, a sense of ownership of their parks. But there's also, you know, there's kind of two ends to that spectrum. If there's so much violence or at least perceived security issues around a park and in a community, it may be very difficult to get people to engage that space. You know, on the other hand, when it becomes a park that is such an amazing, wonderful park that people are asking whether it's actually for them, the neighborhood folks may also not engage it or not be invited to engage it in the planning process. And so there's, you know, it would be nice if these spaces were really places where people develop trust, and sometimes we see that. But in other spaces, the way the process is happening, it's actually causing more distrust.
Yeah, actually, to somewhat echo those comments, I strongly agree. The idea that our public spaces, our parks, we have a duty in the design and implementation and programming of those spaces to have that democratic representation and create a space that is safe and welcoming, so that the conversations, those sometimes difficult social and economic conversations, can take place within our public spaces. You know, as myself representing Millennium Park Foundation and representing Millennium Park, certainly elements of that, the sort of founding three basic philosophies of Millennium Park were free, open access, and democratically representative of the character of Chicago. And you know, I think that those types of themes oftentimes are at the beginning of the conversations when you're talking about developing or redeveloping a park space or an open public space. But somewhere along the lines, I feel like sometimes they often get lost. I don't know where they get lost at, but they often get lost. And we end up with a beautiful, aesthetically beautiful public space that is, you know, maybe family-centric or is certainly useful. But we lose the sort of philosophical vision that maybe have started the conversation around a space where these conversations, social and economic conversations, can be elevated to a level of a cultural neighborhood conversation or a cultural conversation within that space. And I think that's the real challenge in translating from design to a meaningful public space, is how do we maintain the questions and the design responses to those questions about cultural representation in spaces.
And Miguel, you're an artist who works in public spaces, so I'm curious, how you've seen, what role you see those kinds of public displays of art as a way to bridge divides, bring people together, have people interact.
Yeah, I think it's really contested in terms of programming tied to public funding, for instance, or foundation funding. A lot of the nonprofits that I've witnessed throughout the city and also have participated in at the programmatic level, you start to get those sort of censorship roles and glass ceilings put in place directly tied to where the funding is coming from. And it's frustrating for the teaching artists, it's frustrating for the youth that want to express themselves freely. It's problematic in the way that as a society we expect art to be always beautiful, always uplifting, always celebratory. What do we do as complex human beings with all of our other emotions? Where is the art that represents all of us wholly, fully, right? And as teenagers, they have a lot of emotions from minute to minute. And so where are the spaces that are safe for them to explore making art about all of those other emotions? And so I think it's a little bit easier for art instructors contained in classrooms, but when we're talking about making public artworks, even at local park levels, there's a lot of there's a lot of red tape involved, purposefully, I think, to kind of just diminish motivation and momentum and ambition.
And where do you think that's coming from? Is it out of fear of sort of what you might get? What kind of project you might get if a teenager's expressing their angst on the public wall?
Yeah, and there's also like this normative opinion of that all artists design the exact same way, that there's this linear way of knowing 10 steps ahead exactly what the design is going to look like. But if you visit an artist who's loved by the art world and in their studio, they have no idea what the hell is going on until it's finished, right? So how do we give students that authentic artist experience when we're assigning them what the end product is going to be before they even sign up for the free class?
Juanita, I wanted to follow up with something you said, which I think it kind of relates to what Miguel's just said about people feeling this authentic experience. And you talked about people questioning whether a park might be for them or not for them. What determines why people might feel like something's for them or not for them that you've seen?
Sure. There's lots of interesting conversations going on right now. I mean, the Obama Presidential Center locating in Jackson Park being kind of the most obvious one, where the idea is coming forth to the community, and there's a meeting tonight with the Obama Foundation for those who want to go at 5 o'clock at Hyatt Regency McCormick Place and hear what they're planning and try to speak into that. But as we sit in community conversations and see the presentations and hear people respond, we hear people saying things like, that seems more like for tourists to come visit this community and this park than for the people who live here in the neighborhood. And we hear a lot of words about generating economic opportunity, and eventually, at first community residents say, this sounds really exciting, and then they realize that it's really primarily, the lead motivation is generating revenue, and whether it's a nice park for people who live nearby is quite secondary, if even it rises to secondary. And so then people start to either dig in and really get involved and say, I'm going to fight for what I think is good for my neighborhood, and people have very different opinions of what that is, or they say, never mind, I'm out, because this clearly is a done deal and it's not, it's not for me. I mean, the Obama Presidential Center Jackson Park is a super big example of that. Another recent example of that was the 606, the Bloomingdale Trail, and I've lived along the trail for 45 years of my life and struggled a bit with what I was hearing and seeing. And at the time, I was a program officer at the Chicago Community Trust, and kind of hearing the way the story was told, at that level and in those rooms about kind of what was going on at the community level. But when I went to neighborhood meetings about the planning for the 606, I didn't see any other Latinos, and I'm Latina, but when I'm in the room, nobody sees a Latina either. So, there wasn't enough brown and black, right, to make people feel comfortable that the planning for this is taking my point of view into consideration. Yet there's been a lot of excitement about what a great community planning process it was, and depending on who you were, you might have seen that process differently. And so then a lot of folks just opted out quite early on. Like, we know this isn't for us. So, I kept giving people names of Puerto Rican leaders in Humboldt Park who should be brought to the table. And, some of those very folks had already decided, well, we've already watched gentrification march westward in our community, and we know that community planning, quote unquote, is not for us, so we're not gonna bother, right? And so that just kind of brought itself into the challenge there along the 606 development as well.
I see Scott's shaking his head.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and as very much in a way, as a representative of a park that faces a lot of those same questions about who is this park for, who is Millennium Park for. It certainly is for the people of Chicago, but the question is often asked: is Millennium Park, for example, is it for tourism economy in Chicago? Is it for the cultural economy and cultural placemaking of Chicago? Over the last 15 years, we have really struggled with those types of questions at Millennium Park. And because the position of the foundation, we sit sort of at the juncture of the programming of a place like Millennium Park with the city of Chicago, and then also the juncture of the private donors that built Millennium Park, and that in many of these other projects are providing the funding for the public art or the basic construction or the basic planning of these significant public works. My job is to sit at the juncture of those and manage those expectations, and to get back to a point that was made a little earlier as well, manage some of the red tape that comes and those expectations that come with what the private funding stream brings with it, and some of the baggage and red tape and bureaucracy that comes with that. But over the last several years, we certainly at Millennium Park have struggled with the question of, we at the park are a large piece of the tourist economy of Chicago. We also are a large piece of the cultural economy, the cultural placemaking of Chicago. And how do we balance those two aspects, maintain the identity of a park space for the people of Chicago, not just for the immediate neighborhood, because the immediate neighborhood of the Loop District certainly uses Millennium Park as one of their parks. But the real philosophy, the real foundation of Millennium Park was to be all of Chicago's park. And just in the last couple of years, we really have, because of changes in administration within the city, changes of interest from donors, as well as a changing within the Millennium Park Foundation, helping to drive the conversation about how do we create a park in Millennium Park that best reflects the cultural identity of all of Chicago and all of its various aspects and avenues. And how do we do that in this space of art and architecture and cultural experience? And that's a real challenging process. It's a challenging process from when you're first building a park, but imagine doing so once you've had a park that has a certain theme established already, it's in place for 15 years, and you're going back and you're trying to ask the questions that may have been, again, as I mentioned earlier, lost along the way in construction planning, early stages, sort of the growing pains of a significant cultural park like Millennium Park.
If I could pick up on that thread, I think what I see happen is so much we want to get to that capital project, right? How can we get the shovel in the ground when really it'd be great if philanthropy and other sources wanted to invest in the capacity building that should happen on a daily basis. I think we had to read a bunch of white papers in advance of this. And there's a lot of, I think, splitting hairs about what is soft infrastructure, what is hard infrastructure, what is human and what is physical. But is there a way, in a town like Chicago, right, where the story of community organizing for this country was really built here, how can we set up communities for success so it doesn't matter what the project is, but that they're ready for the process, and that through these projects that do come along, that there's that capacity building that happens, whether we build something or not, that community is better off for the next crisis or the next project that wants to drop in from outer space and land on it. And so to me, and that takes some, I think, some will on the parts of folks who like to fund these community initiatives to say, we actually are going to allow these communities to define what capacities they need to build and how they ought to organize, and not ask them to line up with what we like to fund, but rather be willing to allow folks to define it for themselves and be ready for the next opportunity so they're organized and powerful.
You know, Scott, it's interesting because Millennium Park has been called one of the most successful public projects ever. It's up in the top 10 destinations for the state, and certainly top destination in the city. And you mentioned the revenue generation that can come with a big project like that, which a city, you know, to make a just livable city, you need a city to generate revenue. That's part of the deal. And you talked about sort of this struggle, and G's mentioned this kind of ability moving forward. This would be for future projects. How do you kind of engage communities? But for a project like this that's already in existence, where you're trying to straddle that balance of who is the park for, where do you think the Millennium Park has been most successful in doing that? A few examples maybe of some of the programming where that's happened, and where would you say is maybe an example of where we didn't hit the mark?
Well, and I do believe that you hit the nail right on the head, and it is the programming aspect of the park and the evolution of the programming that occurs within Millennium Park. And the city's responsibility, Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, has the responsibility to program and arrange all of the performances and programming that occurs within Millennium Park. And I do believe that is where you have seen this evolution of the improvement of the programming within the park, so that not only visitors to Chicago, but also the neighborhoods of Chicago can begin to see themselves better reflected within Millennium Park. And they start to have a sense of Millennium Park as a part of their cultural sphere, within their cultural sphere, and creates a more welcoming environment. Which is actually at the beginning of Millennium Park, roll the clock back 15 years, which is one of the areas that we really struggled with as a park. The park was constructed in a very traditional philosophical mindset in some instances, or certainly you could say that this higher culture park was constructed with high art, with high architecture, certainly beautiful, and certainly have become iconic for Chicago, but there's cultural ramifications that come with that iconic status. And there's cultural perception that comes with that iconic status. And now breaking down those barriers of cultural perception is the primary goal for the city and its programming of the park, the foundation in its continued funding for the enhancement and future of the park. So I think both the programming and that perception that the programming and the art and the architecture of a place like Millennium Park has, I think that is both our biggest success, but also rolling the clock back, that's also been one of the biggest issues, the biggest struggles, where we didn't quite hit the mark on opening day, so to say.
I feel like everybody has touched on this idea of community perception. Is a park for me? Does this community feel like it's been engaged? Is the student being dictated what type of kind of project is acceptable or not? And I work on a project that is all about community engagement, where we take questions from the public, and I work with a public that's already engaged, meaning if you take time to write a question, it means you already have taken that first step. But even with highly engaged people, it takes a fair amount of follow-up on our part to sort of really get at what people want to know. And so it is this kind of long process. That first step is that little bite that you get, but then there's a lot that goes into sort of keeping people engaged. And so I'm wondering in terms, you know, and Juanita, maybe you could start as somebody who is out in the community and goes on listening tours. What are sort of the keys to a successful community engagement where people don't feel like, oh, this meeting, this project isn't for me, I'm not even going to go show up?
Well, you know, I think in Chicago we do have this neat thing with the Park Advisory Council structure. And we have about 600 parks and about 200 Park Advisory Councils, or PACs as we call them. And so there's lots of parks that still haven't taken advantage of this opportunity, but that PAC is an important place to have a voice in what is going on in your park. Now we have challenges over the years and ebbs and flows in different ways that, you know, we see the park district engaging with PACs, and sometimes they're more open and sometimes less open to the challenges and the advocacy that, you know, the PAC is bringing to the park district. But it's a neat place for, you know, folks who care about whatever thing in their park. It might be their playground needs to be rehabbed, and, you know, they get a bunch of mothers together starting to talk about what they need because they're the ones who are there with their kids every day, you know, using the playground. It might be in my neighborhood in Humboldt Park, it was Save the Beach, you know, and people that really disagreed with each other on certain things, Riot Fest in particular, coming together very much around, we want to save our beach, even though we've disagreed on a lot of other things. So there is this opportunity, though flawed, to, you know, come together to raise money for certain things that you want in the park, but also ultimately to, you know, talk to your park district staff about what's needed in the park, be of support to that person in advocating for what the park needs, but sometimes going beyond that and showing up at the park district board meeting yesterday. You know, there was a bunch of folks there from their different community parks saying, hey, we feel like our park has been overlooked. Give us updates on what's going on with this influence. And so in some communities, that's really the only organized space. In other communities, there's a lot of other organizing going on, and the work around the park maybe is connected to it or an extension of it. But we see that as an important balance to the top-down planning, which, though often well-intentioned, may have a very different perspective than what folks in the community are asking for. And again, you know, I often say and argue that these days, the way parks are addressed in Chicago is largely revenue generation as the first priority, but that may not really address what folks in the neighborhood need. So that organizing through that PAC is a very important space for folks to say, well, that would be nice, but that concert doesn't reflect our community. You know, we'd like a concert in our park, but we would like it to look like this. And some folks have said we want a community benefits agreement around bringing that concert to our park, right? We're hearing folks this morning camped out, you know, in front of where the Obama Foundation's meeting is going to be today, saying we want a community benefits agreement. So if you're going to do all this stuff to our park and our community, we want to make sure that the benefits derive to those of us who already live here.
And how do people think we need to think about that community engagement? You know, speaking a little bit to what Scott said earlier, there's a lot at the beginning, but once the project's completed and maybe some of the initial goals and what people thought this project was going to be about shifts, how do we have to think about that kind of community engagement on a long-term scale, ways for doing it? You know?
I'll take it. I've been thinking about this a lot, and by a lot I mean like the last 5 years. So thinking about not only creating opportunities, but cultivating stewardship and cultivating the skills necessary for people within the community to take over those roles, right? So creating the capacities, whatever they are. If it is to start a new nonprofit in the neighborhood with a certain art initiative, creating that first and foremost, the platform, sustainability, but also looking for local residents to become the eventual employees and staff and take over and sort of like an off-ramping after like a 5-year plan or something like that.
In design process, we try to look at it in a longitudinal way. that, from the very beginning all the way through after the thing is built, have we done a good job of sort of building and I talked about that kind of capacity building piece. I mean, it's kind of absurd to me that the community has to beg the Obama Foundation for a community benefits agreement. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Those should be pillars of these engagement processes from the get-go, and that set of principles that, works all the way through a project. But also it's important because designers and planners we're often very extractive, right? We get to show up, we have the privileged position of saying, well, this is the project, and we have the funder, and we have the city, and we're going to manage this conversation. And I think it's important to think about what you can do to not be extractive. So for example, work that we're doing in New York and in Philly where rather than, let's say, hire a community engagement consultant or do it ourselves, we actually find that community-based organizations that need a little capacity or people who can help organize and say, we will pay you to do it. You live here, these are your topics. We will pay you to learn the skills to do this. So again, you're better prepared next time. We're leaving something behind in terms of a skill set, and we're preparing that group to deal with the next designer who drops in or the next issue that comes. And just that direct payment of resources and development goes a long way, right? People say, oh, we want youth to show up for meetings. Well, how about we pay kids to design the survey and then do the survey and then learn how to process the information? Those kind of leave a foundation for folks to be organizers as part of the next generation.
Juanita, yours.
Yeah, back to the PAC example, yesterday at the park board meeting, Unity PAC in Logan Square was honored for their 30 years of service, right? They didn't just happen because there was a project and then go away. They may have originally come together around a specific need or development in their community, but they've created a system which has included new generations of leadership, younger folks from the community coming up while some of the older folks are still very engaged, so that as crisis moments hit in their community, questions about the park come up, they're still around. Now sometimes there's too much of the same people that were there 30 years ago still in charge 30 years later, and we poke and prod at PACs where we see that happening as well, because you do need the next generation, or you do need to look at, did my community change around me and the folks in leadership are no longer reflective of who's using this park, right? So those questions need to be asked all along the way. And in the example of PACs, these folks are all volunteers. It is a real challenge capacity-wise, and that's why sometimes the same little old ladies are still running the PAC, because it's their social space, it's their control space, and everybody else is too busy, and thankful that somebody's willing to do it. So bringing in other resources in order to help train the next generation, give folks broader capacity building opportunities, I think is great.
Well, and who's not in the room, right? That's sort of the fundamental question. It's easy to design for the middle and the people who show up, but who's on the margins, right? Because the tent goes up anyway if you start on the margins. You start in the middle, you're not reaching everyone. And so I think as we talk about, again, the values and the principles at the beginning of the project, it's a fundamental question, and meetings aren't necessarily the best way to get the best feedback.
I was going to ask about that, meetings, because meetings, they can be really dull. They can be at times that are difficult for people to make it to. So what are some of the what are ways that we could think about community engagement in the sort of non-traditional way beyond the meeting? Do people have ideas for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways to do it. I think there's, right now, folks want to rely on digital mechanisms for that kind of engagement. So I can participate sitting in my pajamas at 10 o'clock at night. But we also need to think about folks who don't have access, where there's a digital divide. We've, parts of this city where it's not like Wi-Fi is such an easy, accessible thing. And so those participation questions are important. So things like doing your homework and really understanding who are the leaders in the community and doing things like interviews and finding ways to identify the interest groups that are at the table and engage folks in, let's say, not a meeting, but maybe there's an activity, or maybe you have kids design an event. You know, we have, there's a group in Harlem that does plays about gentrification, where it's this whole script to explain to a community the processes, but through theater. So I think there are a whole number of ways to get people in those conversations.
If I may, you know, Friends of the Parks for years has been, you know, engaging people to dig in the dirt and be part of the cleanup in their park. So there are many folks who are engaged with their park through Earth Day or for regular maintenance and, you know, cleanup days that have never heard of Friends of the Parks, may not know of their park advisory council, but they are certainly engaging their park, right? And, you know, back to some of the art stuff, we also have a program where we've worked with youth doing placemaking, and we've had youth looking at how do they envision the space that they occupy, they choose the space to focus on, and how do they want to engage it. And we had some kids decide they wanted to do an art project for Simon's Park, and Simon's Park told them to go away. So they had to go back and think about a different way to address it, because the park itself didn't want to receive the art that they wanted to kind of come up with, and so they took their art to a different green space. But that's an engagement opportunity where the kids are not coming to a PAC meeting, but they're certainly learning about it and thinking about what does it mean to engage my park district, what does it mean to engage my open space, and then what do they want to do about it for their life.
And not to talk too much, because I am, but you have to meet people where they are, right? And so it's always asking people to show up here where we decided you ought to show up to so we can have this conversation is not always the best way either. You have to figure out, where do people go? Do you need to show up, you know, at church services on Sundays? Do you need to just be sitting? You know, we've done engagement sessions at Walmarts because that's where people were showing up, and stand out in front and talk to folks. And so, and that's also a way of, I think, of sending a message that we have respect for the way this community works, and we as designers and planners need to adapt to that, not expect people to change the way they interact or might show up.
I want to talk a bit about, you know, we've talked about sort of this having equitable access to kind of engagement in these projects, and this kind of idea out there that we have a problem sometimes of perception of what is for whom. In terms of sort of having something be accessible, I'd love it if you could all sort of define what does that mean? How do you define having access? Is it transportation? Is it free? What is it? How do you define what access means, equitable access? You know?
What comes to mind is that the content needs to be interesting enough to the participant or the potential participant, first and foremost, right? There needs to be voluntary interest. And I think a lot of what you're talking about, I've also seen over that at least the last decade in programming for youth, is that transportation is the #1 challenge for teens or middle schoolers that are trying to find out where a sport event is, or a program around art, or anything like that. A lot of the institutions that are downtown-centric are struggling still with figuring out how to do community programming. So because of CTA being such a huge challenge, it really is the leading factor in stopping people from coming from neighborhoods to downtown programming. I've seen a handful of institutions do some small short-term initiatives to try to engage in different communities, either doing it directly and then realizing that they should backtrack and better partner with a neighborhood organization that already knows the neighborhood. And what that ends up trickling, it sounds like a nice narrative, but what just happens is like they just partition some funding for programming. And so it doesn't really feel like an authentic engagement from that parent institution that's downtown. It just looks like a nice end of the year report recap.
So what would be a better way of doing that?
If I had that answer, I don't know.
Have you seen on a small scale where something was a success?
Yeah,
Like what?
sure. Inviting parents, first and foremost, being open late at night. People work second and third shifts, being open on Saturdays and weekends. So all of those sorts of legwork, that blood, sweat, and tears, that tires out a staff in 3 years, that burns that turnover really quickly. That's all it really, really takes. Not everything needs to be an 8-week program. Maybe there's just like a family picnic day that's open to the community. Food and music always bring people out. Those, yeah, seem to work.
Cta, when you think about equitable access, what does that mean?
I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the really important points, notwithstanding food really is a key. You know, and some of the work that we've been doing in Philly and in Memphis is about analyzing what is happening in a neighborhood in terms of services and opportunities at what hours of the day, what days of the week, and then which civic assets, so which is it the library or the park or social service center are offering those programs and when. And so we try to do that analysis because you find that there are these gaps. So in Southwest Philly, for example, there's this super library where they have great job training programs, and they actually lend ties so you can go on an interview, you know, because folks in the neighborhood, they don't have suits or whatever. And so they have these great job training programs, but they're all 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. So if you have a job and you're looking for that training, you can't go. But the park that's down the street, that's in a reasonable walkable distance, they're actually open on evenings and weekends. And so what we've been trying to push on for this question of access is not thinking about how do we staff that park facility and just think about the core competency of what we define parks as doing. But can we think about that park and that library as being connected to each other, that the programming maybe needs to cross some of those boundaries, because it's that idea of meeting people where they are. If that library is closer to the population that needs, you know, for example, a flu shot or, you know, health checkups, but those normally happen at the park, can we just cooperate a little bit and get that programming where it ought to be? I think those are the ways in some cases, for getting more access to the services and things that people want.
I mean, there's so many different questions that we ask, you know, many of which have already been pointed out, but cost is always a question, right? So when people say, do you take a position on concerts and parks? I say, does it cost $100 to buy a ticket to the concert, or do I get to go free? And if it's on public land, should it cost $100, right? So how accessible is something that people in the neighborhood can't afford? Is a golf course that is PGA level golf course in the community that is going to cost $200 accessible? Maybe, you know, some people will be able to get in there at a cheaper price. Will there be real tee times available to them so that they actually get to golf on the public golf course? Concerts like Millennium Park concerts, and when we've done our listening tour, we've had a lot of people say, I just can't go to parks where I can't afford the parking. You know, so, or I can't find a parking spot. We hear that a lot. I mean, we've heard people way on the southeast side say that they drive all the way up to Montrose Beach because they can't get a parking spot or can't afford parking at 31st Street Beach. You know, we've had people in our listening tour say, I never go to Millennium Park or anything in Grant Park because, you know, me and my 7 kids and grandma, we can't afford the bus fare or the parking. So can you help us enjoy that park? So there's a lot of ways in which costs and parking access make things that might still be free. There might be a great concert, and I was saying the other day that I have a whole lot of Mexican friends that were on their Facebook page, you know, hearing some mariachi music at Millennium Park, but they were also all college educated. You know, they weren't necessarily people who can't access their local park because of security issues. You know, it doesn't solve that problem because they can't afford to go down there even though the event itself is free.
And what are the challenges to keeping those events free? I imagine, Scott, that's something that you all, I mean, with the mandate of, you know, the Millennium Park of having it be free and open access, what are some of those challenges to making things free and accessible?
Well, and the whole discussion as a recovering academic, the whole discussion around equitable access has me having these minor flashbacks to conferences and meetings where we would discuss equitable access to academic programming and such. So I find it interesting that, and then also as an ecologist by training, someone who thinks in natural systems order, that idea of tackling equitable access from a a systems perspective. You have to analyze and examine the entire system. I think that's a really key and interesting point in looking at how access plays into creating valuable, culturally significant public space. But then with regards to creating a space like Millennium Park where you have free programming, but then you also have access issues. I mean, yes, transportation is our chief access issue, equitable access issue point. It's not easy. Logistically, it's easy to get to Millennium Park. Cost and some of the other logistics around that prevent people from accessing the free activities, the free programs that go on at Millennium Park. So then sometimes the questions begin being asked when this question is brought before the group of us that discuss access to our free programming at the park. The questions often come up, well, if you charge just a few dollars for a concert at Millennium Park, can you then shuttle that money in some way that tackles these questions of access and actually getting to and being able to use Millennium Park? And again, that cuts to the core philosophy of the park, and we always kind of say, no, we're not going to go that route. But the struggles in maintaining a free open park, they're actually quite interesting because particularly at Millennium, you have this confluence of the city's desire to use Millennium Park free programming as a talking point that we offer these significant cultural experiences, and they're all free and open to the public. But at the same time, the budgetary reality of maintaining that openness and that freeness of our programs, then that's where the foundation, for example, comes into play, and the interface between those private donors and the city and managing the expectations, managing the sometimes the friction that occurs between those two entities, those two groups, to keep this space free and open and free from over-commercialization, free from falling into the trap that many of our public spaces across the country have begun to slide down the slope of looking at ways to use what used to be free and open public space as revenue generation points in the current economic situation across many cities. And the foundation fighting back against that, being the counter current to that argument. And I think that touches on or creates a lot of problems for us when we're looking at how do you maintain something that is a large infrastructure sort of budgetary draw, lots of money to maintain, lots of money to keep the park where it's at structurally, but then also how much do you rely on sources of city funding and so forth. But there's always that constant friction between, say, the foundation wanting to maintain that free, open philosophy, but then also the other interests in using the park because it is a huge draw. I mean, you have 20 million people a year that come to Millennium Park. So if you got everyone to generate $1 of revenue, the park would generate $20 million of revenue. And that's that's significant when it comes to a city budget. So you have forces wanting to generate that revenue within this open space, and then you have the foundation countering those forces to maintain at least a degree of that open, equitable access.
I mean, you really have to focus on where your revenue engines are, and that the value proposition for that revenue engine, like a Soldier Field that's owned by the Chicago Park District and the Bears pay rent, and one, New Direction concert kicks off $1 million of revenue net for that weekend that could be spent in neighborhood parks. You do have to follow the money to the neighborhood parks, but the proposition is there, right? We can probably all be okay with Soldier Field doing what it does if I can make that specific connection to a neighborhood park, and I think that's where the thread gets lost. And also, how do you get the successful programs that only want to be downtown or maybe only want to be in Millennium Park, how do we get you into a neighborhood park? Because the fact is there are kids in the city who've never been to the lake. They can only see downtown from a distance, and so sometimes we have to bring those services out there. And bearing in mind, too, though, that the consequences of having public-private partnerships, right? How do you keep the public in the public-private partnership is important, but you look at a city like New York, right, that is grappling with issues of park equity because all of its signature parks, you know, you're not just Central Park Conservancy, but Battery Park City, you know, you can name them all. They have drawn all of those philanthropic dollars, which need to be leveraged for the parks where no one cares to throw money at it because they can't see it out of their penthouse window. So I think there's a slippery slope, and that it's partly the job of the public sector and the privates to figure out how do we demonstrate the value of what we're doing here in Millennium Park, for example. How does that benefit the neighborhood park where the kids want to put up art and nobody wants to deal with it? Like, how do we draw those connections? And I think that's the challenge for that kind of set of partnerships that make public investments useful for cities.
Well, and if I may, even the neighborhood parks that host some of these things, you know, does the money that comes into the system through Riot Fest stay in the Douglas Park community? Does the field house stairs that are crumbling at Douglas Park get fixed because they hosted Riot Fest and the community dealt with the burdens that come with that? And the answer a lot of the times is no. And so it's not even just a downtown thing. It's a, you know, we're pushing all these things out to neighborhoods for reasons that someone might think are good reasons, but neighborhood folks are not seeing the return to their own park for hosting these events.
I'm curious whether people have thoughts about, you know, we've talked about so many of the projects that we've seen, the Riverwalk, Millennium Park, the 606. These are these kind of mega large scale projects. They often span more than one neighborhood. And so they're not all necessarily downtown. The 606 isn't downtown. But as a city sort of has to think about kind of how it focuses its revenue dollars and benefits sort of its citizens, how does a city have to think about sort of large scale versus sort of smaller scale neighborhood projects? And what would some of those kind of small scale neighborhood projects look like?
Yeah, I mean, you do have to operate at both levels. If you look at the study of the economic, we're talking a lot about parks, and I hope you enjoy that because there's kind of a barometer, I think, for the health of a city, right? If your parks are doing pretty well, looking pretty good, it's a nice indicator. But if you look at the economic impact study that was done of parks in Chicago, it's the most extensive one that's done in any city. It looks at all of the parks and looks at the influence on property values within a 2-block radius of each park. Right, that's significant. And so parks on the whole in Chicago add 1.5% to property values within a 2-block radius of that park. And so that's actually a big number. That's actually a lot of value. But what's so interesting, I think, about that study was that it's the small parks as an aggregate. Small parks, the ones with the broken bench with nothing in it, maybe a playground. The small parks as an aggregate add 3.5%. Right? And so these small pieces are actually, they're not only stabilizing neighborhoods, they're adding value. And so there's a value proposition made for those kinds of investments. And there's in this city in particular, that's a civic asset that you can do something with. We own that in common, and we own the street. And the whole anatomy of that block where that park resides, there's a lot to work with. And so there needs to be a strategy that is thinking about the margins of the geography of our city itself. I mean, you look at Mayor Kenney in Philadelphia, who starts with equity, right? And who passed a sugary beverage tax and beat big soda for $500 million for parks, libraries, and pre-K. Makes the value proposition and then is saying the lens that we're looking at this through is equity. So we're going to start small, and we're going to start in neighborhoods because the center is doing fine.
I want to just shift gears a little bit because I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk. We're sitting in a city of Chicago where violence is a big issue, and I realize that none of you are criminal justice people or social workers, and that if we could solve the violence issue overnight, we would be doing that, and it's complex. But I'm curious how you see the role of kind of communal spaces, parks, communal spaces, places where art is on display, what role that can play in helping to address the violence issue here in the city, or how we have to think about that. Is there a role for architects? I've seen Jeannie Gang, who runs Studio Gang, saying, architects should be thinking about shootings.
Yeah, so there's a little bit design can do. To be really clear about, if we're talking about, let's say, an issue like safe space, and there are so many pieces of that, right? Having a safe space has something to do with jobs. It has something to do with education. It has something to do with youth engagement. There are all these pieces to it. When we had done some work here in Chicago for the biennial last go-around, it was an exploration of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing report that was coming up with really advice for local police departments, build trust and legitimacy. I mean, it's not rocket science, it's hard to do, but there are a lot of ideas that came out of that report. And so, we were thinking from a design perspective, relationships happen in space. You build trust in a place. Is there something design could do toward that end? And so we worked on a project in North Lawndale at, near Douglas Park. And it was more about a process of getting folks to the table that range from, the commanders and people, on patrol, that sort of thing, all the way over to folks who were part of Black Lives Matter and the Invisible Institute, and asking this question of how do you build trust, and does design have anything to do with that? And so the upshot of that was it was really about getting people to the table, talking with each other, youth and police and people on all sides of that question. And that group decided, we were just conveners, right, which I think is what design can do here, is get people to the table. And folks decided that the right peace-building opportunity was a very small thing, which is a basketball court on a police station parking lot, which is there. And so we helped raise a little money and got it built. And it's one of those things where I'm definitely not saying, every police station parking lot ought to have a basketball court, or basketball is a key, or any of that. It was right at this moment, and it was a riff on a memory folks have had of one time where there was a temporary hoop and folks played together. And so those kinds of things, it's a small thing. There's some design, I guess, in that. But it had the kind of influence where on the day that it opened, you had kids who were walking by with a ball, and they're walking past the police station because they actually can't take that perfect 10-minute walk to the park directly because there are gang lines and these invisible barriers that prevent people from moving the way you imagine they might move in a neighborhood if you're just looking at a map. And so they're like, can we play here? We're like, yeah, you can totally play here. But more importantly, a year later, we went back because the police station had a new commander, and the sergeant was worried that he was going to get rid of the court, and so we had to go in and make the pitch. And anyone go to meetings with Chicago police officers, there's a lot of silence. And so did the best dog and pony show, and then he sits, silence, and he goes, can we make it bigger? Could it be a park? Could we have National Night Out there? Could we do all these things? And so that was sort of this recognition by someone who was not part of the process to say, oh, this is working. And so the last piece of that story that I think is interesting is the police department itself sent out a tweet in July. So this is 2 years later. Another thing architects and planners could do better is to actually go back after you're done and say, did this stuff work? The police station tweets out a video of officers and kids playing ball. The officers aren't in uniform, and they said, come out to our community court, hashtag building bridges, hashtag peace building, right? No one asked them to do it, and they figured it out. So long answer to your question, but there's something. There's a small thing. And so if you look at the toolkit you have, if you're a planner, what can you do? I think that's the question. What can you do if you're an architect? You can't do everything, but you need to contribute.
Interestingly, folks at La Villita Park, which has been mentioned, actually talk about the fact that their park is up high, that drive-by shootings are not as much of an issue for them, which you don't think about, but it is a brown field and raised, and literally if someone's at street level and just shoots ahead, it doesn't reach them. But more importantly, they've done tons of community organizing around that space and engaging youth through sports, through relationship, through other community organizing in the community, and have then said, okay, now we've got La Villita Park under control based on our community, volunteer, and restorative justice oriented ways of addressing these things. Now let's go to this next park where we're still struggling a little bit more with the gang activity around it. So I think, there's the community organizing and engagement, and then, occupying the space positively by anybody is important, but I think the local kids feeling ownership and that this is their space and this is something they helped to create makes a big difference. I just think back too about the art in my community growing up in Humboldt Park, Logan Square, and graffiti, and whose art that is would make a difference whether it would get tagged or not. And if this is our art that represents us, then it gets more respect than if somebody else comes in and does this art, which I kept asking as the 606 was under development. Like, we're getting rid of the murals that have been here for years. As the plan comes to put new art here, whose history and culture is it going to reflect, and what is that going to mean for how the community engages it, including tagging it or not? So.
And Miguel, as someone who you work with youth in the community, you're doing graffiti art, which Juanita just talked about. What role do you see of that in terms of the violence prevention, the role it can?
Yeah, I think a little bit more important than the work that that I'm included in being a part of is, I'd like to take this moment to highlight the important work that Eddie Bocanegra has been doing in Pilsen. He's been doing an amazing job with, he just left the YMCA, unfortunately, but he was in charge of a very small branch at 21st in Ashland. And I believe it was the only gang violence prevention programming in all of the YMCA. And so he started that and has been leading it. And what that looked like was, let me pick up these 6 gang members from different gangs individually, bring them to our branch, a car ride by car ride, and then get a YMCA van at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday after YMCA is officially closed, and let them play basketball together from 10 p.m. to midnight. Those kinds of things. Let me buy a DJ controller and some cheap speakers and let them play around with the equipment without a DJ instruction program in place. Those sorts of casual tinkering, just creating the environment. I think that has literally saved some of those people's lives.
We just have a few minutes left here before we need to turn it over to audience questions. Just I thought maybe all of you could kind of close with, if you could speak to the policymakers and the leadership, and talk about how you'd want to see sort of the engagement between leadership and communities. If you could sort of give one piece of advice of where in the next 5 years you'd like to see a change made, what would that be? Scott, you can.
Well, I think that as parks, as public space begins to play more of a significant role in being a space in which conversations, art, cultural activities take place that are welcoming and reflective, that we need to spend less time thinking about our parks in a traditional ornamentation sense, that they're an ornament to a broader neighborhood development process, or they're an ornament or some type of beautification process to a broader urban or a district redevelopment project. And that our park spaces, our public spaces are really critical infrastructure components, not only from a ecological, environmental standpoint, but then also from a social cultural standpoint, part of the social and cultural economy of an area. And that those types of conversations need to be very critical between political leadership, leadership of parks organizations, park districts, planning districts, and so forth, and the communities, the citizens of the areas that are these projects are going on in. Oftentimes that conversation doesn't happen in those contexts, and I think that's really critical moving forward. Absolutely.
Yeah, along that line, I would implore the Chicago Park District and the mayor to really see park advisory councils and other organized groups that may not technically be recognized as a PAC as real partners and not threats, because currently that's a bit more of the way the relationship works. And the Park District receives PACs that agree with them in one way and those that do not agree with them in another way. But oftentimes that tension is a healthy tension that really needs to be addressed and worked through to see the nuggets of real understanding of what's going on in the community and what the needs are that's being voiced by neighborhood residents.
I guess I would say, because I have had the opportunity to say things, I would say if the key public policy question that you want to move the needle on is, let's say, reducing violence, then you need to wake up every morning and ask every city department, whether they're streets and sand, whether they're parks, whether they're water rec, I don't care who you are, but what are you doing today to reduce violence? Because you know what? Streets and sand can actually do something. Signs of disorder, clean up the garbage, keep the streets, have a strategy, line it up with where the hot spots are. What are parks doing? What are you doing every day? Because a kid that's in a park, in a camp program in the summertime is a hell of a lot safer. And so why are there any kids not in a program in the summertime who need to be? So you assume that every agency, no matter what their focus is, that they need to have a plan and some alignment around what we want to move the needle on together as a city. And then you just got to march forward that way.
Get the last word.
What I would say is don't perform public engagement by offering 3 charrettes over 3 months that are going to align with the agenda you already have. Sit down for 5 years and shut up and listen.
Ooh, that's it.
On that note, we're going to shut up and listen to your questions. And I believe is there a mic coming around? Here's somebody.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Nicole Johnson. I had a question to Scott specifically about the high culture that's incorporated within Millennium Park. And I'm wondering, how can you incorporate more of the culture that's current within the communities? Specifically, I'm from Inglewood, so Bronzeville, thinking about the musicians that grew up in those housing projects. Pullman, bringing some of those actual images along those cement pillars you have down there, maybe moving a bus of DuSable to the center to speak about this city was founded by a black man, right? So then that kind of incites tourists and other people who are indigenous to the city to say, hey, maybe I should go to 63rd Street. Maybe I should see what's happening down there for myself, and have a more nuanced picture of the city, because the communities make the city. And we need to make sure that people realize that. So.
No, you're absolutely spot on, and that is something that we are and I say we collectively, so that is the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events from the programming aspect of things, and then the foundation from the curation of the park aspect of the park. That is something we're faced with, and that is something that we are tackling at the moment. So for example, within Millennium Park, we have these spaces called the Boeing Galleries. Traditionally, those have been a rotational art exhibition. 18 to 24 months, we've invited international artists through there. This next year, over the next year, I've challenged the curatorial committee for that to say, you know what, I'm tired of having internationally recognized artists that are a name draw. Yes, that's great, but are a name draw to this space. I want to better reflect questions and history and artistry of Chicago. So let's be a little provincial about this, and let's say, you know what, we have wonderful art and artists in Chicago that reflect the cultural dynamic of Chicago. Let's bring these people and their history and their artistry into these spaces and use this internationally recognized art exhibition space to better reflect what Chicago is about. So the tourists that come through the park have a better flavor for what the artistry of Chicago is, for example. And then because of our interpretive signage and so forth, they're able to find their ways from those exhibitions into the neighborhoods, maybe a local cultural center or a local artist center, and they can then experience that firsthand within the neighborhood. So that transition that you're speaking of is exactly what we're tackling over the next year, and we're moving forward with. And that's one of the big sort of points at which we're pivoting the philosophy of Millennium Park around.
There's a question the front here. Okay, gotcha.
Hi, I just wanted to, I'm so excited to hear you guys talking about community engagement in parks, and Juanita, I love you. Sorry. But on the subject of Jackson Park and the Obama Library, I've been community organizing and engagement for over 30 years in Chicago, in that neighborhood, in Inglewood, on the south side. The city's come a long way on public engagement from its days of the Plan for Transformation with CHA, which was a total farce. You know, it was this, here's our plan, thank you for listening, we're gonna go now and build it. But it's still, you know, the Jackson Park Watch Group. I'm not sure who all is in that group, but it's organized by 2 women from Hyde Park. That's not Jackson Park, that's not Woodlawn. That community benefit organization that is organizing now outside of Jackson Park Watch camped out overnight last night to make a statement about their needs as a community as this library and golf course are planned. How do we get that more engaged and more ingrained in the city's process to the community, the idea of a community benefit agreement, these park projects that we talked about, the 606, what was the first thing that happened after 606 besides random muggings? Rents went up all along the route. How do we make sure that people who live there can afford to live there and that the city values that as a part of its planning?
So that's our fight and the questions we ask every single day these days at Friends of the Parks. And I actually often mention that I personally have lived 45 years along the 606, and 1 year after the 606 opening, my rent went up $450 a month, and I don't live there anymore. And clearly I could afford, you know, a change in my rent and much more than others in my community. So it is a really big deal, and folks in the Jackson Park area, many of them are asking that question. Some very excited about development in the neighborhood, but others saying, I'm pretty sure I won't be here to benefit from this. I just say organizing, organizing, organizing. And every time somebody kind of gets frustrated at us that we're not respecting the former president, I'm like, he was an organizer and he can handle it. So, you know, he needs to be challenged, you know, to live up to the ideals of citizen engagement that they say that the Obama Foundation is about. And so, you know, folks don't all agree. I mean, we have, as Friends of the Parks, participated in every table we've been invited to in the area, and that makes about 7 tables that I and my board president, who's a few seats behind you, who lives in the neighborhood, you know, attend to try to hear and speak into all the conversations. And there clearly is not one point of view about what should happen around, you know, whether it should be in a park, should it not be in a park, what should happen if it is in a park, what's good, what's bad. But we just keep encouraging everybody to organize. And let me say, too, that those points of view are not neatly broken down by white people who live in Hyde Park versus black people who live in Woodlawn or whatever. It's way more complicated than that on all sides. But we encourage people to keep organizing because we haven't seen the city or the Park District or the Obama Foundation, who we've been holding to a higher standard and have chosen to believe that they would maybe have a bit of a higher standard in light of the president's history and the words coming out of the foundation about citizen engagement. So we just say everybody should keep poking.
Well, on the gentrification line, I'm going to make a plug for the Voorhees Center here at UIC that has done a lot of work developing a gentrification index, and then also what are some of the tools that communities can use before, during, and even after to help folks to stay in their homes. You're welcome, Janet. Yeah.
There was a question down at, okay, all right, got about 5 minutes.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Parrish. I'm a UI student here. I was like one of the people who were camping out last night Concrete isn't so bad. Yeah, my question was pretty much specifically to Mr. Scott, Mr. Miguel, and Ms. Gia. What is your understanding of a community benefits agreement, and why do you think folks like myself are pushing so hard to get it?
So,
Go ahead.
I mean, I definitely defer to Juanita in terms of expertise. And my comment earlier, I think, was that I'm disappointed that an organization like the Obama Foundation that's talking about community organizing seems to struggle with making it easy for communities to organize and get engaged. So I think I'm hopeful that they'll continue to work on that. It shouldn't be so hard, frankly. I don't know if you want to talk more about the agreement.
Yeah, I'll let you guys go, and I'm happy.
I echo the exact same sentiment that that it's a little disturbing around the idea that this process has been so far so difficult or difficult for communities to have a clear and equitable voice within the process to this point, and that's concerning from my philosophy, my personal philosophy, as well as the organization I represent about free, open, and representative public spaces. That's a concern, certainly.
You know, it's also disturbing, I guess, is we've already been here, right? The Olympic bid, right? 2016 bid, and I worked for the Park District, so I know all about it. But we're just continuing to try to do things in the same way and find these big ideas that we just want to land on what looks like available open space on a map. And I feel like in the last 2 decades, we do a better job of learning how to do those things. Maybe we can get to a good place on it, but in a more collaborative way. We don't seem to be learning enough, I think, from the institutional side.
Guys.
Veronica Williams here. Check. Okay. Veronica Williams here, Chicago State University, former reporter for WBEZ Radio. How I so miss Tori Malatia. He has done a great work with WBEZ Alexandria. To Miguel and to Juanita, thank you for providing for the blacks and browns in the community. And Gia, you as well. Your passion, Gia, I feel it. Scott, for you, a question. It was a great idea that Gia had for the young people in the neighborhoods to have that same millennial, and I'm speaking parenthetically as well, because we do have millennials in our neighborhood as well, but for them to have that millennial park experience. Have you patterned or pursued any research? You know, we're researchers here at Chicago State. We can help you in your pursuit to bring Millennial Park to neighborhoods like mine, Roseland, Inglewood, Woodlawn. Have you followed that research pattern just yet? Have you developed that yet? Do you have a team?
So no, we have not. And I say we, the gentleman you need to speak with, not throw any particular individuals under the bus, but that is Commissioner Mark Kelly at the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. The department, that Cultural Affairs has the authority to program Millennium Park. So I work in concert with the Department of Cultural Affairs, but I'm not a programmer of Millennium Park. But however, I am a motivator of the people that program Millennium Park. So I need, and one of the missions that Millennium Park Foundation has taken on in the last year and a half in looking at ways to create a more open and inviting space within Millennium Park is to find community organizers, to find community research groups that have that information and that we can partner with and that we can be better advocates to the city, to the Department of Cultural Affairs. In much of the way the park advisory committees work, I have much a similar role, and I welcome the opportunity to do that. And we've done that with public art installation processes in Millennium Park. I'm certainly welcoming of the role or welcoming of the opportunity to do that with respect to the overall cultural experience of Millennium Park. Absolutely. I've
been given the time, wrap it up. I've been given the wrap it up signal, but we've got one more question. But we're out of time. Yeah, so we're gonna take a 10-minute break. There are coffee and snacks in the lobby, which you are all welcome to, and we're gonna reconvene back here in 10 minutes. Thank you all for doing that.